Well, my name is Steve Heller, and I'm a recently retired English teacher. And one of the questions that we're here to discuss today is what is the role of inquiry in historical argument? But I really want to start by talking about inquiry in English classes. And when we think about inquiry, we really think about uh, that which speaks to sort of a universal condition. So, for example, an authentic question that students at the school that I worked at would discuss would be, what does it mean to belong? And when we ask that question, what does it mean to belong? The things that we read, the things that we write, the things that we discuss sort of address that more universal feeling, universal question. But for 8 years, I taught a course in American Studies, which was combined with AP US History. And I have some questions about what inquiry means when it comes to historical argument. And I'm here to ask you, Chris, your thoughts about that question.
Well, thanks, Steve. I'm Chris Freiler, and I teach Advanced Placement European History and a philosophy course. I would say that historical inquiry, which obviously overlaps to some degree with what you would just describe as an organic process in English, is driven by what historians call historiography, which is the literature of historical interpretation. Now, at a beginning level, let's say in high school, an advanced placement class, or an introductory course in an undergraduate level, the student is not going to be conversant with all of the different schools of interpretation, but it orients around asking an interpretive question, which is productive because it focuses with the students' goals of investigating the sources, investigating primary sources, secondary sources in many cases, and then trying to assemble those into an argument. So in Crosscurrents, in our first chapter on definition, we examine the definition of the frontier. So in US history, the frontier obviously plays a major role because one of the themes of US history is migration over time and over space. And so the traditional view of the frontier is a line of demarcation between that which is civilized and that which is savage. And we wouldn't obviously use that expression today. And so that's how the historical inquiry can change over time, is as we look at different perspectives, in this case, including new actors, African Americans, Mexican Americans or Mexicans, Native Americans, you begin to change your understanding of the frontier as a place of interaction, not just with different groups of people, but also with the environment.
Well, Chris, I understand that. And one of the things that I am reminded of as you're speaking is that the history teacher says one of the worst things we could do is to always say, and here's how it relates to today. Mm-hmm. Here's how it connects to today. That we must treat the past as sort of a different landscape, a different country, and just immerse ourselves there. And my question to you is, if we say, all right, sort of what's universal about the question of the frontier, am I short shrifting the discussion by saying, well, how does it relate to today? And to bring in your examples with new actors, African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and so forth. Am I selling that short by making it relevant?
No, that's a great question. I think there's two responses I have to that. I think historical questions and the way that we approach the past is always conditioned by what we're concerned about today. So I think beginning in the 60s and 70s, there became what's called the new Western history, which was to kind of leverage some of the changes that had gone on in the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, to look at the definition of the frontier in a much richer way with multiple perspectives. So I think that's always part of it. So whether you like it or not, I think the past will always be influenced by what we're concerned about today. But at the same time, I wouldn't, in teaching my course, try to leap too far ahead to how is this relevant to today? So you suggested it. I think we should first start with the pastness of the past and try to understand the past within the historical context of the time. That doesn't mean we have to suspend all judgments. You first have to understand what were the concerns of the era. And then once you've done that, you start to say, what's useful about the past that we can use today to help us have a better understanding of these issues?
When we think about that kind of approach, do you see this as kind of a chicken and egg situation? What I mean by that is that, let's say I was teaching this idea of revolution in an English classroom. I might begin by saying, all right, students, when's the last time you felt like rebelling against something? And I would start with that sort of immediate feeling, that immediate recognition, and then say, well, now let's take a step back and see what happened 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and so forth. Do you see that as a valid or maybe just accessible way of entering into a historical argument when it comes to something like the definition of frontier, the definition of revolution?
Sure, I think that's a legitimate way to motivate students engagement in a question. Plus, it also helps the teacher assess what is their common understanding of revolution. And then I guess I would see my job as complicating. I always feel like that's my job, to complicate their understanding of history. And I think most people have a working definition of, in this case, revolution as a violent overthrow of a government. But obviously, there's different ways you can think about that. And you would come to, I think, a richer and more precise understanding of what a revolution is by looking at various revolutions, which would include nonviolent revolutions. Mm-hmm. So in Crosscurrents, there's the example of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance against the British Empire, and he thinks of that as a revolution. You also have other interesting cases where, the Nazis in the Third Reich thought of their regime as a revolution against the old order. Usually we think of a revolution as from the left to overthrow the traditional features of government and society. So that also is an interesting question. Is the Nazi Third Reich a revolution against what might be perceived as the left or the center of the political spectrum?
Right, and by sort of defining revolution with such an extreme example like Nazism, and really expanding our way of defining that term and seeing how it relates to lots of different contexts.
Right.
Another question that I'm thinking about, and we have to do diligence to our friend Aristotle, who's given us these 5 common topics. And definition seems to be one that really ties well into this question of inquiry. What do we mean by X? What do we mean by Y? So, and I was struck as an English teacher by seeing recent questions on the AP US History exam that have a more definitional quality. For example, how do we define citizenship in a particular era of American history, or to do sort of comment on America's sense of national identity? These are sort of more macroscopic kinds of questions, and to me they signal a shift from past DBQ questions, and maybe inviting sort of more of that definitional interpretation. What's your take on those kinds of prompts recent years?
Right, I think that's a great question. I, as a philosophy teacher, think definitions are critical. I think they're often overlooked or downplayed. I just don't think you can evaluate or assess anything, whether it's a historical period or a present moment in time, without having a clear definition, whether that's the term progress or frontier. For example, in the course I teach, European history, one of the most common words to show up in any prompt, LEQ, DBQ, whatever, is enlightenment. And so it's testing, let's say, the French Revolution. It's testing the Haitian Revolution. It's testing the ideas of the late 19th century against the standard of the Enlightenment. So if a student doesn't have some definition of the Enlightenment beyond just something generic, the Enlightenment was about new ideas, they will really struggle with answering that question. Right. I think the task of the history teacher and the English teacher is precision in language and getting students to, at the beginning of their essay, commit to, like, here's my definition. And so what I'm going to discuss historically, my content will be evaluated according to this definition with nuances. And I think that's where the complexity of a student argument comes in.
And I would also think that those nuances also include some of the other common topics. For example, Aristotle writes about circumstance or context, and that's going to really change the way in which we view a particular word. So the Haitian Revolution, which is a uprising against slaveholders, is going to be a little bit different than, let's say, the American Revolution, though ostensibly there's an oppressor and a bad guy, but a little bit different look, a little bit different feel to it as well. And the changing context allow us to change our definition, which is a point we also make in Chapter 1 of Crosscurrents.
Right, and that, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the DBQs last year on the European history exam was about whether the Haitian slave revolt was motivated more by the conditions of enslavement or by the Enlightenment. And so this complicates our understanding of Enlightenment, which, let's face it, was originally within the context of a mostly white, mostly European, mostly male environment, although there were obviously famous women who were saloniers. But here you're adding different voices, whether it's Mary Wollstonecraft with a feminist perspective, or Toussaint Louverture, and adding a perspective of, like, now we need to include the idea of race within our understanding of the Enlightenment. So that's what I was talking about before, is making more complex our understanding of these terms.
So in a world of soundbite cultures, headline news, shortened social media posts, do you see inquiry as leading students to wanting to read more, to know something about something? One of the questions that I would ask my students, for example, is to reflect on whether the progressive era in the early 1900s really spoke to their own definition of being an American in terms of 2024. And I was always struck that the more substantial responses were the ones that immersed themselves in historical content and contemporary voices as well. And that's the question that I have for today. You know, can we have an inquiring mind, and is there a guarantee that an inquiring mind will encourage us to read more deeply, to find out more about something?
Right. I think that's the way that you try to engage students, is asking an open-ended question, which has not one right answer, but multiple perspectives. And I think that runs a little counter to maybe a little bit more traditional direct instruction, where the teacher says, here's what's important, here's what you need to know. Obviously, the teacher plays a role in framing the question and providing students with like some avenues that they could go in different directions. But I think it's the task of the teacher to provide students with a rich set of resources to then dig into that question and formulate it. And so it lends itself well to, let's say, an activity of a debate, or even just a short little kind of forum where students take different perspectives on a particular issue. So yeah, I agree strongly with that idea that inquiry leads itself to a further investigation that's driven by the person who's asking the questions.
And what you're also speaking to is, I think, a lot of things we're seeing in more current iterations of English classrooms, which are student choices about the text that they read. So rather than the English teacher being sort of the purveyor of a single text or a purveyor of a single point of view, I'm going to be knowledgeable about a wide range of texts, and here, kids, here's a choice, have at it. But I think at the core of that is genuine inquiry. Do you want to know more about not just your perspective, but other perspectives, and how will that create a more nuanced and thorough argument?